Hello class, I'm Dr. Mo, and today we're going to explore the concepts of longevity and regeneration and biological immortality. Immortality is, of course, the idea that an organism can live indefinitely. And in fiction, immortality is usually reserved for gods or, let's say, magical woodland creatures that can change form at will, or like, I don't know, powerful female demons that seduce young men so they can slowly drain their souls. You know, like spirits and stuff. In any case, immortality is, well, it's a real thing in biology. Biological immortality, however, is defined a little bit differently, though. Mortality is the process of aging or dying. And so biological immortality is when an organism has either stable or decreasing mortality. In other words, organisms that don't really ever age to death. But this should not be confused with the idea that an organism cannot die through other means, such as being injured or consumed or dying from diseases or lack of food or some other resources. Actually, for most biologically immortal organisms, being eaten is probably the most likely outcome. To understand biological immortality, we have to first understand what the process of aging is. So, for the sake of discussion, let's focus on aging at the cellular level first. In most multicellular organisms, like humans, our current understanding is that a normal cell can only replicate through divisions so many times before cell divisions basically just stop working. This is known as the Hayflick limit, and in humans, normal cells are usually limited to somewhere between around 40 to, say, 60 divisions before they are no longer able to divide anymore. In fact, after so many divisions, many normal cells are essentially programmed to die. This is what we call apoptosis. In some organisms, entire organs and body parts are programmed to die. So, after a number of divisions, the organ may just fall off. For example, did you ever wonder how a tadpole, which has gills and a tail, turns into a frog, which has lungs and no tail? Well, what happens is the gill cells and the tail cells apoptosis. That's right. These cells are actually programmed to die as the tadpole matures into a frog. Personally, I think that sounds like a horrible way to change shape. But it is how adult frogs are made. Cells in humans and most other multicellular organisms also just sort of degrade naturally over time. And in order for any organism to grow or function, existing cells must be able to divide and ultimately replace the older, worn-out cells. And in a human body, individual cells have very different lifespans. For example, a typical skin cell on the outer layer of your skin only lives for about 1 month. Red blood cells in humans live for approximately 4 months. You may have heard before the idea that for most humans, every, say, 7 to 10 years on average, all of the cells in your body are entirely replaced. So, like every decade, you are an entirely new person? Well, that's not quite true, of course. The cells in your heart, for example, they're only replaced every 40 years or so. And some of the cells in your body, like those in the lens of your eye, well, they live with you for your entire life. They are never replaced. And interestingly, human brain cells are thought to have a longevity of more than 200 years. But humans never actually live this long. But if they did, they would probably have trouble because brain cells aren't built in such a way that they are ever replaced. So, at least for the technology that we have today, this means that a human probably could never really ever live longer than, say, about 200 years. To make cells, new cells, an existing cell divides, and it becomes 2 new cells. This is a process that you've probably heard described before, and it's called mitosis, where a cell duplicates all of its contents, including its chromosomes, which are here sort of shown as little red and blue X's. But the chromosomes are long, thread-like structures that occur in the nucleus of animal and plant cells. And they are composed of proteins and DNA. The DNA, of course, holds all of the information that is unique to an organism, like its biological blueprint. Near the end of each strand of a DNA is a sort of special section in the chromosome called a telomere. And telomeres act to protect the chromosomes from damage or, say, accidentally fusing with other chromosomes. So each time a cell divides, these telomere regions of the chromosome, they get shortened just a little bit. And after many divisions, the telomeres will progressively get shorter and shorter, and this is effectively how a cell can be programmed to die. Eventually, these telomeres reach some sort of critical length, and this leads the cell to stop being able to divide anymore. And more of an organism's cells can stop being able to divide over time, and then the whole organism progressively undergoes what we call aging. So for whole organisms, without being able to grow new cells, the accumulation of damage over time basically cannot be repaired. And this is what we view of as aging. In biology, the process of deterioration with age is called senescence. And there are some cells that can occur in humans that will never senesce. They have an abundance of a special enzyme called telomerase, which constantly lengthens the telomere sections of the chromosome. Unfortunately, these cells in humans are what we call cancer cells. Cancer cells aren't programmed to die like other cells, but they also aren't programmed to ever stop dividing either. In any case, a typical sign of a multicellular organism that is undergoing senescence is that gradually, with age, their reproductive ability decreases, their metabolism begins to slow, and they generally become weaker. Senescence is pretty common in all or almost all multicellular organisms, but for some, it just doesn't seem to happen. Let's see an example of this. We'll talk about one of these sort of odd creatures that doesn't seem to age over time. It is the American lobster. All lobsters and crayfish and shrimp, they have something that we call indeterminate growth. And what this means is that they don't grow to a specific size and then, say, just stop growing. Lobsters are surrounded on the outside by their exoskeleton, and in order to actually grow, they molt. The idea of molting is that they leave behind the hard exterior of their skeleton, which was confining their previous size, and then once free from their exoskeleton, they grow and then eventually harden a new exoskeleton in the place where the old one used to be. And lobsters can actually molt and grow very, very rapidly when they are young, up to, say, 40 times or more in a single year when they are juveniles. Also, when they molt, lobsters can regrow limbs and repair other types of damages to their exoskeleton. But as they grow larger, adding mass each time, their growth starts to slow and their molting becomes something more like, say, once a year and eventually once every few years. Lobsters, kind of like the cancer cells we were talking about that could occur in humans, generate the enzyme telomerase, which means their body cells are not programmed to ever die. Interestingly, being larger in size usually means that lobsters can be more successful with respect to reproduction. So their reproduction rates don't slow as they age, which is one of the signs that suggests senescence. However, the whole process of growing an exoskeleton requires a lot of energy. And as lobsters get larger every time they molt, it becomes harder and harder to acquire enough energy to successfully molt. And then eventually, they either try to molt and fail, leaving themselves vulnerable without an exoskeleton at all, or they stop molting altogether, and as a result, they are unable to repair the damage to their exoskeletons. So while lobsters don't really deteriorate as they age, they really aren't anywhere close to being immortal. Unfortunately, it's difficult to tell how old a lobster in the wild actually is. And this is because most of the components that we might use to determine their age are shed off with each one of their exoskeletons when they molt. However, just based on the size and growth rates and other aspects, scientists can estimate that the age or the maximum upward age of an American lobster is something like 140 years old. Okay, so aging cells in multicellular organisms is usually linked directly with the ability for a body to have its cells replicate. But why are cells programmed to die? And what if you only had one cell? What about single-celled organisms? Well, I think to understand this, we kind of need to go back in time and let's go back to the very first life forms on Earth, dating back to somewhere around 3.7 billion years ago. The earliest organisms on Earth were single-celled, and they all replicated by a process similar to mitosis, except in single-celled organisms, we usually refer to this as binary fission. In other words, there was one organism composed of one cell, and then it divided, and it became two cells, which were both identical clones. And what is interesting about this is that the whole organism becomes two new organisms, and there's nothing left of the original organism at all. And if we try to view this in the context of aging, these types of organisms fundamentally do not age. They just continue dividing as many times as they can, and they do not experience the telomere shortening problem that we discussed in human cells. In fact, sort of as drawn here in this sketch, the chromosomes are usually ring-shaped, and they don't actually have strands at the ends that could shorten at all. They form from one parent organism, and it also did not age. And some of that parent DNA material from the oldest organisms on the planet were handed down to every single cell. So, how old is the organism? This is a problem with single-celled organisms. If they divide and they become two organisms, it's hard for us to figure out what age even means. And I guess by definition, they are biologically immortal. Does this mean that there are immortal single-celled organisms on Earth right now? Yep. Bacteria and yeast are both examples or groups of organisms that are indisputably biologically immortal. Some laboratory colonies have been maintained for over 25 years, and these types of single-celled organisms have undergone more than 50,000 generations without any sign of aging. But you probably remember Amoeba, right? The single-celled animal? You know, this one? Don't they reproduce through binary fission? Yep. So these silly, simple animal blobs that you stared at under the microscope in biology class, amoeba are biologically immortal. In fact, amoeba can indefinitely repair the normal wear and tear of living faster than it even occurs. In fact, most single-celled organisms are actually biologically immortal. But somewhere along the way, sexuality evolved, and this probably occurred with the first multicellular animals or fungi about 1 billion years ago on Earth. And eventually, plants developed sexual reproduction as well, forming seeds. The first of these we found in fossil records around 320 million years ago. So, sexual reproduction has a lot of advantages for an organism. For example, it allows for the exchange of genetic material, and for the organism, this vastly improves how adaptable that organism can be. But it appears to have come at the cost of giving up on their immortality. Once an individual has reproduced sexually, it is essentially disposable. Well, at least with respect to the survival of the species. In multicellular organisms, the daughter organisms are no longer composed of the original materials of the parent, and instead, multicellular organisms that have adopted this strategy, well, one individual can have many, many offspring, and that organism can persist for years, producing offspring the entire time. So, why do the cells need to die in multicellular organisms, though? I mean, what could be the advantage of aging cells that have a limited number of replications before they shut down entirely? Well, this is a fairly philosophical question, but perhaps the answer is, without this sort of programming, multicellular organisms can no longer get rid of diseases or infected cells. As we discussed with cancer cells earlier, if they do not age, they also cannot be stopped, and this often has disastrous consequences for multicellular organisms. So, is biological immortality a thing that still happens in multicellular organisms? Or has it been traded away completely? How long do multicellular organisms typically live? Well, the oldest human being to have ever lived, to date anyhow, actually died in 1997, and her name was Jean Calmant. She was French, and she lived to be 122 years old and 164 days. So, what was the secret to her longevity? Well, apparently she smoked cigarettes, ate chocolate, and drank wine every single day of her life. Jean, however, had a shorter lifespan than our estimates of the oldest living lobster by about 20 years. But it's pretty impressive nonetheless. Well done, Jean. Are there a lot of animals that could actually live longer than lobsters? Sure. So some tortoises have been known to live for almost 190 years. And the oldest known living mammals are actually the bowhead whales, which can live more than 210 years. And there are many fish and sea urchin that have also been known to live up to 200 years. And, well, one of these fish is a koi. It was estimated to have lived for 226 years. And, well, I bring this up because koi are basically just fancy goldfish. And if there's one critical factor that I hope you take away from my lectures, it is this: never underestimate the goldfish. Okay. So the oldest vertebrate organism to date, well, it's actually this shark, the Greenland shark, which has been determined to live at least 300 and possibly as much as 400 years. So how does it do this? What is its secret? Is it cigarettes and chocolate? Sadly, no. The Greenland shark is what is known as an ectotherm, and we'll return to this concept in a later lecture, so you should try to remember it. An ectotherm is an organism that produces very low amounts of heat within their body, and they rely mostly on heat from their environment instead. One big advantage of being an ectotherm is that, well, basically you can operate at a very low metabolism. And in the case of the Greenland shark, they live in nearly freezing water. It would be polite to call the Greenland shark's swimming speed sluggish. They have the slowest swim speed and tail beat frequency for its size across all known fish species. Their top swimming speed is a blazing 2.6 kilometers per hour. That's about 1.5 miles per hour. And for reference, that is surprisingly close to the normal crawling speed for a human being. A weird curiosity of the Greenland shark is that their diet consists mostly of seals, and the seals swim about twice as fast as they can. I guess they just do a lot of sort of sneaking up on dinner. So, is there a relationship between having a slow metabolism like the Greenland shark and longevity? Well, almost certainly. In fact, some of the oldest and slowest growing animals on Earth are actually corals and sponges that live in the cold, dark depths of the ocean. This is Ming, the mollusk, and, well, it was actually the oldest verified solitary animal on record. It had lived for 507 years, and we know this because mollusk skeletons have growth rings, like tree rings, in the clam's shell itself. And, well, the biologist that discovered Ming, he also did him in. So rest in peace, Ming. Like the other animals in this list, Ming and other long-lived quahog mollusks do it by having a very slow metabolism. And as a result, they age very, very slowly. To find known older multicellular organisms, we have to shift into the plant kingdom now. While most trees have lifespans that are sort of in the hundreds of years, there are examples of many old individual trees that have lifespans ranging between 2,000 and 4,000 years. And in fact, the oldest known individual tree in the world is named Methuselah, and it is a bristlecone pine. And Methuselah also had its age determined by counting its growth bands. Tree rings were counted from a tree core, and they suggest that Methuselah has an age that is close to 5,000 years old. So how do these old trees manage to have such longevity? Well, actually, for most of them, they use the same strategy as the Greenland shark. They have very slow metabolisms, and they grow achingly slow. And they're often found in high altitudes where the resources are very, very scarce. Okay, so is 5,000 years old as multicellular organisms can get? Or is there still a chance that we could return to biological immortality? Well, for plants at least, some have managed to reinvent a type of immortality, at least in some form. The perennial plants have something underground, and it's a mass that we call a stolon. And the stolon actually connects the organisms together, and like strawberries and garlic, the plants become colonial organisms. They share a common root mass that can actually reproduce indefinitely, asexually, without any type of seed or spore or anything else, growing from the common root mass. And in these plants, a viable clone can be created from just a fragment of the parent organism. And in a way, these plants have achieved a type of biological immortality. In other words, as long as the stolon isn't destroyed and the plant has sufficient nutrients, it could probably continue growing indefinitely. So, a strawberry is essentially immortal? It is. And there are many trees and even some mushrooms that actually live this way as well. A type of honey fungus grows like this, with a series of mushrooms all growing from the same interconnected root-like structure. Genetically, this colony of mushrooms are all identical, but most of the mass of the organism is underground, and a colony of this fungus actually occupies an area of almost 10 square kilometers in the state of Oregon in the US. And this one organism is thought to possibly weigh 35,000 tons in total. It got the nickname the humongous fungus, and it is thought to be the largest living organism on planet Earth. And, incidentally, scientists suspect that it may be more than 8,000 years old. Colonial organisms such as these are numerous and potentially biologically immortal. Similarly, there are tree colonies around the Earth where the trees at the surface may be less than a few hundred years old, but below the ground, their roots are connected into one organism that may be 10,000 years old or more. And one of the most famous of these, and quite possibly one of the oldest colonial tree organisms on Earth, is this one. It is named Pando the Trembling Giant, which is quite a name. And while Pando only occupies about half of 1 square kilometer, it weighs in at about 6,000 tons. And while the estimates for the root mass of Pando, they vary pretty widely. Its actual age is likely somewhere between 10,000 and 16,000 years old. There are Lomotia shrub colonies in Tasmania that are estimated to be more than 43,000 years old, and a colonial seagrass colony in the Mediterranean Sea that is thought to be more than 80,000 years old. Clearly, these types of colonial organisms are essentially biologically immortal, and they easily rank among the longest-lived multicellular organisms on Earth today. That is, if we don't count the cheaters. What do I mean by cheaters? Well, it turns out that an organism's lifespan does not exclude the time spent in a metabolically inactive state. Have you ever heard of Buck Rogers? I'm guessing you haven't yet, so I'm going to give you a quick history lesson. In 1987, the life support system on Buck's spaceship malfunctioned, and, well, he was frozen until his drifting spaceship was found in the year 2491. And he was brought out of suspended animation, and he was like 525 years old or something. And, well, when they brought him back, he was forced to wear spandex and fend off the advances of substantially younger women almost once a week for 2 whole years. Anyhow, my point is that I'm guessing old Gene, with the cigarettes and the chocolate, Gene probably would like to request an asterisk be placed next to Buck's Wikipedia entry as the longest-lived human. Some organisms are just simple enough, however, to be resurrected after years of surviving in a suspended state like this. For example, in 2018, some scientists from Russia found some nematode worms that were collected in a frozen state from the Arctic Circle. And they were able to reactivate them after 40,000 years. So, technically, the nematodes were some of the oldest living multicellular organisms on Earth, but they kind of Rip Van Winkled their way there. And in 1990, a microbiologist claimed to find yeast living dormant in amber for 25 million years. And after bringing this yeast colony back to life, rather than turning them into, say, a deadly amusement park, he founded his own brewery and he made 45 million year old beer from the yeast. So, cheers. Okay, probably the most convincing biologically immortal multicellular organisms are yet to come. And the first of these is the Planaria, or so-called flatworms. Flatworms are interesting because they reproduce sexually, or at least they can, and, well, this leads them to the sort of typical reduction of telomere length, as it does for most organisms. But the flatworms are unusually good at something called regeneration. How good? Well, if you cut a single flatworm into 250 equal-sized pieces, it will regenerate into 250 whole flatworms. In fact, if you cut the head of a flatworm down the middle, but let's say you don't completely sever it from the body, if you let it regenerate, you will get a two-headed flatworm that will continue to live, and both heads will share the same body. Like many of Earth's most unusual animals, flatworms have also made an appearance on the International Space Station. And it turns out that when they were severed into pieces in zero gravity, well, they regenerated into a double-headed worm. Flatworms are the subjects of a ridiculous number of equally gruesome and yet fascinating studies. They have nearly limitless ability to regenerate, and the asexual reproduction resulting from this regeneration of the flatworm, it appears to elevate their telomerase levels and reverse the effects of aging that they took through sexual reproduction. So effectively, these flatworms can sort of set the clock back each time they regenerate, making them biologically immortal. Regeneration is a particularly interesting trick in the animal kingdom, and some organisms are even known to amputate themselves in order to avoid predators, for example. Then they will regrow those parts that were lost. And this is called autotomy, and it is particularly common in things like sea stars and salamanders, which can regrow limbs and other tissues. And in the news recently, there was a sea slug. And what it did was decapitate itself and then continued to move around with the decapitated head, missing all of the major organs in its body, like its heart and its digestive system. But instead of dying, it simply regrew its entire body in the span of 3 weeks. It's expected that the organism does this when its body becomes infected as a way to basically salvage itself. Like the sea slug and the flatworm, the hydra is also an expert at regeneration. Hydra, however, approach regeneration a little differently. They have stem cells that are capable of indefinite self-renewal. And in other words, they continually replace all of the cells in their body over the span of a few days. Any fragment of a hydra's body that is more than a few hundred cells large, if it gets separated from its body, would have the capacity to regrow an entirely new hydra body. Like the flatworm, hydra actually have two pathways for reproduction. When conditions in their environment are good, a hydra will reproduce asexually in a process known as budding. Effectively, they just break off a piece of their self intentionally, a type of autotomy, and then it will mature into an adult hydra. And if conditions in their environment become unfavorable, the hydra will switch strategies and grow male or female body parts and then switch to a form of sexual reproduction. And the result of this is something called resting eggs, which will basically persist in the environment until things become favorable again, and then hatch and will return to our asexual reproduction cycle. Because of their incredible ability to just regenerate practically from anything, hydra effectively never undergo any form of senescence. And as you should expect by now, this makes them one of the few organisms that are indisputably biologically immortal. Our final biological immortal organism, like the hydra, is a type of cnidarian. Its common name is the immortal jellyfish, which I suppose is an indication that it should be somewhere on our list. The immortal jellyfish, like all jellyfish, live a multi-staged lifestyle. The pattern goes something like this. You start with fertilized eggs. These become a larva, which in jellyfish is known as a planula. And the larva can swim, well, not very well, but enough to find some sort of a home on the seafloor where it attaches. And at least for a short term, it becomes a benthic organism. And while it's here, attached to the seafloor, it grows a colony of polyps, which eventually grow into the Medusa phase, which is basically the free swimming organism. A Medusa clone are what we would call the typical thing we identify as a jellyfish. And these jellyfish can reach maturity in the span of, say, a few weeks. What's interesting about the immortal jellyfish, though, is that when the adult is injured, its response is not to regenerate the damage like the hydra and the flatworm. Instead, it just reverts to the polyp colony, reattaches somewhere to the bottom of the ocean, and then produces more Medusae clones. So instead of regenerating, the immortal jellyfish just sort of opts to hit the restart button. And every adult Medusa can basically continually hit the restart button whenever they are damaged. This process is called transdifferentiation, and it means that the immortal jellyfish can turn an adult cell that serves a specialized process into an entirely different type of specialized cell. So the immortal jellyfish are kind of like recycling rather than regenerating. Okay, well, that is the end of our lecture for today. And if you have questions, I could answer them now or, also at my office hours. That would be a good time to also ask them. I'll start with a question that I have, which is, why are scientists so fascinated with all of these different strategies for longevity and biological immortality in multicellular organisms? Well, this is because, of course, they could perhaps find some sort of clues about human longevity, regeneration, and healing, and potentially by exploring how these organisms have managed to do it, it will reveal secrets for slowing, or perhaps even halting, the aging process in humans altogether. And this leaves us with a question, which is, how long could a human being ultimately live for? Okay, so do you have any questions? Perhaps they research it because they are scared of dying. I mean, it's healthy to be scared of dying, I suppose. Let's see. D. Ross asks, are there any examples of artificially made organisms capable of reaching biological immortality? This is an interesting question. I don't know what you mean by artificially made organisms exactly. Like a robot? Green Apple suggests maybe we could regrow lost limbs. Yes, and certainly potentially regrow organs or something like that. Would be highly valuable for us to at least figure out how these organisms have done it, just in case. Sawneedle asks, do you think clones could retain memory? I suspect they do not. Although this is an interesting question with respect to multicellular organisms, which don't really have a memory, but they may have experienced things, right? But I suspect when you regrow your entire body, everything gets lost. Other than your instincts, that is. Are there any other questions before we dismiss class for the day? All right then. It's been a... Oops, not exactly. Thinking more about lab rats or stuff like that. Well, most of the organisms that we clone, yes, like Dolly or something. Generally speaking, I would say these organisms have shorter than average lifespans, and certainly none of them have been made into biologically immortal organisms, at least today. Is genetic memory a thing? This seems like maybe it's a question for a following lecture. Well, okay, seeing no more questions, I did want to tell you one thing, which is that we have planned for our lecture next week. We already have an idea of what it's going to be, and I'm expecting it to be parasites, in particular, zombie parasites. It should be very interesting. All right, class. I want to thank you for hanging out with me tonight and listening to my lecture. Hopefully we learned something interesting about biological immortality, regeneration, and the longevity of different types of animals. For now, I will see you next time. Feel free to drop into my office hours, which are tomorrow night. Thank you.